So welcome, Richard Schutte, to Curi0sity. So Cheryl and I started Curi0sity because we're curious and we think that a lot of people have got a lot of fascinating things to say and we're not hearing it. So that is why we started it. And we invited you because you have a unique experience of being involved high-level banking, but also you have an understanding of history and philosophy and art, and you're doing something very exciting in the universities. So I suppose the first real question to you is what makes you so curious?
Well, I think, I mean, the world we sort of inhabit, Dale, is really complex, and we all suffer from this sort of human condition. So I really think that life's all about learning and trying to sort of make sense of that world. And that includes, thinking about the world, but it also includes experiencing the world. And if we can sort of integrate our thinking and our experience, we have a better capacity to navigate that world. So I really do believe that we live in a universe that's perpetually learning, and we are part of that universe, and we have this incredible capacity to learn.
Fantastic. And this today is called Standing on the Shoulders of Giants. Why does that topic just really excite you so much?
Well, I think, there's a lot of criticism happening in the current environment around Western civilization and Western society. And I think there's this rich history of knowledge and inquiry that's particularly relevant to the West. And I think there's a huge opportunity for society to be building on that history. So rather than not sort of reflecting on that history, there's an opportunity to sort of think about the ideas that have been shared over time, integrate and synthesize those ideas, and then sort of take them to the next level. And if you look at the history of, philosophy, for example, in Western civilization, the modern computer came from some ideas that Aristotle had 2,500 years ago, relating to, this idea of metaphysics and reason. So for example, Richard is a man, all men live in Sydney, Richard lives in Sydney, is just a simple example of using the process of thinking and logic to make deductions about the world. So there's this incredible opportunity for us to do that, but also go beyond Western civilization, because I also think there's incredible insights in, for example, Indigenous culture, in Middle Eastern philosophy, in Eastern philosophy, and with the internet, where we can sort of share information now at the speed of light. There's an incredible opportunity for us to be exploring that rich terrain of knowledge.
That's wonderful. In the education space, we use a really simple simple analogy, which is comparing and contrasting. Mm-hmm. And it's used to, in assessment processes and, very generally as well across school systems. So I'm thinking about that when you're discussing their Western civilization and other civilizations and their influence. So my question to you is, and I'm really curious about, how you might think about this, is that if we're going to compare and contrast the great things about Western civilizations and the great things about other civilizations that could improve our Western civilization, how could we understand the West and the Western civilization better? Because we can't compare and contrast if we don't know what something is and isn't in the first place. So I'm curious.
Yeah, that's a really great question, Cheryl, and I'll sort of respond to that by just sort of providing you with a bit of an outline as to how I sort of make sense of Western philosophy over the last 2,000 years in a very sort of simplistic and reductionist way. But when, people like Aristotle, people like Charles Darwin, people like Alexander von Humboldt, who sort of came up with this concept called Mother Nature and looking at nature as a system. What they did was they went into the world and they discovered the world. So they discovered the world, and so it was all about trying to make sense of the world. So how can we sort of look at the patterns of the world, and try to make sense of it and come up with heuristics or stories or narratives that bring some coherence to that complexity of discovery. Now, when you discover the world, you are not part of the world. You're not in the world. You're actually abstracting the world. So you're simplifying all that complexity. And that led to, the scientific revolution, the age of enlightenment, the digital revolution, the industrial revolution, and it created an incredible amount of prosperity in Western civilization. And then came along another set of philosophers called the continental philosophers. And they sort of took this sort of view that, we can sort of think about the world all day long, but we also need to sort of think about our experience in the world. So how do we make sense of the world through our experience? So people like Kant and Hegel, Wittgenstein, a whole bunch of people out of the Frankfurt School of Philosophy, they all didn't look at the world through this sort of reductionist analytical frame, but looked at the world through relationships and structure. So things like, the ideas of Karl Marx, who was his ideas around the economy and how the economy sort of worked, and the rights of workers was an insight that sort of came out of his experience in the world, and how there was quite a lot of inequality between the owners of the assets and the people working in some of these organizations. So that's structuralism. That's the second type of philosophy. And then there's a third type of philosophy, which is, it came out of the late 19th and early 20th century, out of the United States. And it was called pragmatism. And what the pragmatists tried to do was sort of integrate your thinking with your experience in the world and recognize, the nature of the human condition, the complexity of the world that we're living in. So people like, most people haven't heard of this individual, but he's probably the most important Western philosopher since Aristotle, Charles Sanders Peirce, or there's a gentleman by the name of William James or James Dewey. John Dewey. These are all sort of pragmatist philosophers that try to integrate both their lived experience with their ideas. And I see, one of the challenges I see, or the crisis that I see in Western society right now, is anchored in this, the issues that emerged from René Descartes. I think, therefore I am, which sort of drove, the scientific revolution. It's driven computation, all these type of things. But the problem with that sort of thinking is that that's all about abstraction, and we can sort of abstract all day long. But if we don't actually sort of connect that abstraction with our experience of the world, there's a risk that we move further and further away from the world, and we actually become disconnected from each other. And we also come up with simple stories or a simple world when the world's complex. And I saw that throughout the pandemic, where the science was sort of held out to be absolute, when it's really a process of learning. I see it in our economists, how they talk about the economy in really simple mathematical terms. And I see it in geopolitics and a whole range of other areas. So I think the West has particularly got an issue at the moment, in that their thinking is taking precedence over their experience and the world. And this sort of comes back to these sort of two worlds that are starting to collide, with the nomenon world, which is the world that existed without us here. So, the physical world, nature, Mother Nature, those type of things, was a world that sort of existed before we started, we were here. And then what happened was we introduced this phenomenological world, which is this world of experience and creation. And that's where humans are in the world. So you see this a lot in the environmental movement, where people want to sort of set up national parks around the environment. But the reality is the environment, we all live in the environment. We're in the system. We're not sitting outside the system.
Yeah.
You know, this idea that you can have objectivity without observation. You know, we are in the system. I think our school system and the way we're teaching people throughout society reflects this sort of abstraction. You know, there's a wonderful painting by a Belgian surrealist artist from the early 1930s, I think it might have been, or the 20s, called it's got a French title, but I'll just say it in English, which is "This is not a pipe," which is just a picture of a pipe. And what he means by that is it's a picture. It's not the world. You know, the world is complex, it's high dimensional, it's ever changing. And we try to simplify the world, but too often we're confusing the simplification for the complexity of the world. And so, you know, there's a tremendous opportunity to start integrating our mind and our body and realize that some of these things like computers are tools, but this sort of idea you can have sort of artificial general intelligence that's disembodied, that sits in a computer, to me is a sophism. It doesn't make any sense at all. But it's a narrative that's been embraced by society. You know, Steve Jobs, when he envisaged the iPhone, I mean, there's a wonderful recording on the internet from the early to mid 1980s, where his inspiration for the iPhone was a bicycle, and he called a computer a bicycle of the mind. Now, that's a completely different narrative to the narrative of artificial general intelligence, which is a very sort of dehumanizing way of looking at some of these tools. So I think a lot of our ontology and the concepts we're using don't actually reflect what they really are. And this idea of change, you know, the world is in a constant state of change. The person I was yesterday is not the person I am today, nor is it the person I might be tomorrow. Yet we have this desire for certainty and knowing, and a reluctance to change, when the reality is that everything's changing all the time. You know, so I would actually argue that we're more like a river than a table. You know, in terms of you know, we're constantly changing, we're constantly evolving, we're constantly learning, and that's, you know, some of those ideas are better reflected in Eastern philosophy than Western philosophy. There's a gentleman by the name of David Kellogg-Lewis. He's probably one of the most important metaphysics philosophers since over the last 400 or 500 years, since Leibniz, and he talks about, you know, this sort of nature of being and how we're actually ever evolving, changing systems. So I think a lot of the frameworks that we continue to embrace don't actually reflect the new fitness landscape. And I would actually argue that our education system needs to be completely revisited to do that. Otherwise, we'll continue to suffer from more and more cognitive dissonance.
You're just ringing my bell there. As an educationist, I've spent you know, essentially my entire professional life unpacking and rebuilding an appropriate education system. Is absolutely spot on. So I'm curious about your distinction between school education and lifelong education more broadly.
Well, I think there's a concept in physics. It's the most amazing theory. There's a gentleman by the name of Professor Adrian Bejan, and he came out with this sort of, he was focused on thermodynamics and how systems change. And he came up with this new sort of natural law. I think it was in 1978 that he initially released his paper called the constructal law. And what it basically means is that for a living system to survive, it has to morph and change over time. And I use that analogy, our morphing and changing as individuals, we physically time, but we intellectually change over time as well. So I into, you know, certain time periods in our life, just doesn't equip us well for the world that we now inhabit. And, you know, I truly believe that we need to sort of embrace lifelong learning. And I also believe that we need to increasingly integrate our ideas with our experience. So the work I'm doing with a university at the moment on innovation and entrepreneurship is all about providing them with some of the key principles and theories that sort of sit behind some of the concepts I'm talking about, but then also introducing to them business and corporate partners that are already doing what I'm talking about. So, you know, this idea towards a network economy. You know, we're moving from products or services to ecosystems. We're moving from corporations to networks. You know, the nature of leadership is moving more towards a network style of leadership, or an organic ecosystem style of leadership. So we will introduce a term, some of those terms like that, but then we'll have an organization that is doing this. And by sort of integrating the doing with the thinking, you know, I think there's a nexus that then gets created where people become, you know, it starts connecting our ideas with our actions.
Yes, well, I do remember watching an interview with some Stanford graduates, and that they all had been incredibly successful. And one particularly young woman got up and said, yeah, it's interesting, when I did my MBA at Stanford, they said, first you do this in business, then you do that, then you do this, then you do that. She said, it was nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. It's totally chaotic, and you've got to try and make sense and create something out of this chaos. And she said, so it was nothing like the modeling that they were doing at Stanford was nothing like the reality.
Absolutely. And I think the other thing around, so concepts like sense making, you know, so there's a gentleman by the name of Carl Weck who sort of was an organizational theorist in the 1970s. And it's this idea of how do we make sense of that complexity? How do we bring a coherence on that complexity? And what we tend to do is we see things that represent our beliefs or our models of the world within the world. And that's an important way to bring that sort of coherence out of that complexity. But at the same time, what we also need to do is have the capacity to reflect on those truths and beliefs. And I see it time and time again where people might be sense making, but they're not actually reflecting on their truths and beliefs. So when their experience of reality no longer aligns with their ideas, they're not willing to revisit their ideas. And I would actually argue that that sort of breakdown in that integration leads to ideology and dogma. And the problem with ideology and dogma is that you start moving further and further away from reality. And it has real world consequences. You know, Franz Kafka has this saying, in a fight between you and the world, back the world. So, you know, the world's way too complex for any of us to understand. And the only way that we will be able to sort of navigate that world is through perpetually learning.
And would you say, because you've spoken to me before about science and scientism, and would you say that there are natural laws that we can rely on because they're repeatable and we can see them and we can know them and we can trust in that? And then there's scientism, modeling, and is that where you're going with this, with the ideology, that you end up in an ideological space that can't be repeated or proven?
Yeah, so Aristotle, who's the father of modern day science, when he thought about the world, he had a theory of causality that actually had 4 dimensions. One of those dimensions was teleology. The other one was around how does the internal system work, etc. But he never sort of reduced the complexity of the world down to a single thing. You know, we need to do this because the world's entangled. It's too complex for us to understand. But what he did say was that there are certain static patterns in the world where we can draw conclusions. So, for example, if I throw a ball into the air, it will fall to the ground. And whether I do that or you do that, or Cheryl, you do that, you'll experience the same phenomena. You know, likewise with the sun rising every day. So these are patterns that I would call static and changing world.
Sorry, static and what? I just lost you for a second. What did you say?
Oh,
static?
sorry. They're static patterns. They're sort of eternal or relatively eternal. they're not changing. They haven't changed for a long time. Patterns that are relatively stable patterns, static patterns. But the world we live in is like a river. So most things in the world don't behave like that. They're clouds, they're more like clouds than clocks, and are highly predictable. And what's happened over time in science is that those claims have moved from those sort of static patterns into things that are far more complex. And to do that, the scientific community have sort of embraced peer reviews and central limits theorem and statistics and a whole bunch of other things to determine what is true. And I would actually argue that a lot of these claims can't be made because we're entangled. We are in the world. Our actions actually have an impact on the world. We're not sort of sitting on the balcony looking at the world. So if we're going to sort of increase our awareness, we need to not only look at our claims on the world, but we also need to sort of revisit our truths and beliefs in terms of how we think the world is. And I've written an article on this on Medium that anyone that's interested can have a look at. But I think, there's issues in science, there's issues in economics. I saw it a lot in business management, which is what I call algorithmic business management. So we're focusing on return on equity, we're focusing on maximizing earnings or shareholder value, without recognizing that organization is also part of a larger system, and that you can't just reduce your behaviors down to a single dimension. You have to sort of think about yourself in the system. And there was a really good example of this that happened during the COVID lockdown. I think there was an announcement in Europe where a whole bunch of the leading football teams decided to move to a breakaway competition, and it was almost like a super league for football that they were looking at launching right across Europe with some of the best teams across Europe. And a couple of days after the announcement, there was a huge backlash from those fans of those football teams who felt that they weren't sort of engaged in part of that process. And that to me is an example of this sort of reductionist Cartesian thinking. And if I sort of contrast that, there was a football team in the Netherlands, in Holland, I think it was Ajax, AJAX, that during the lockdown won their national league. But because of the lockdown, none of their fans could attend the games. So what the team did, it's my understanding that they actually melted down a version of the trophy that they won into hundreds of thousands of little ingots and badges and sent them out to their fans. And that to me is a really good example of moving away from a sort of algorithmic reductionist way of seeing the world to recognizing that no person's an island, that we're all entangled with each other. So the football team's only as good as the fans that turn up and the broader community. And that's a real sort of shift. But our education system doesn't talk about any of these things that I'm talking about now. And that's why we're seeing more and more cognitive dissonance. This idea of artificial general intelligence or computational biology. I have real fundamental issues with some of these concepts because these ideas then get placed into the world and it actually has consequences that none of us can predict. So we need to sort of recognize that complexity, and we need to recognize the limits of what we really know, which is this sort of eternal part of the human condition, our fallibility. And that's why it's important to have a diversity of people sharing their insights in society. I call it a heterodoxy versus an orthodoxy. And we need to have open inquiry, and we need to be fallible. We need to recognize the nature of the human condition. But if we do that, we move beyond the ego state to one of learning and one of growing, and it better aligns ourselves with the world that we inhabit.
Interesting that you're constantly talking about learning, and Dale and I, couldn't agree more with the importance of lifelong learning. Two things I'm curious about. The first one is You mentioned earlier clocks and clouds. I want to come to that in just a moment. But my first curiosity here is, I haven't heard you use the word teaching yet. So where does teaching fit into the context of what you just said then around diversity of learning?
So I think teaching's a really interesting concept, because there's a certain dialectical relationship between the teacher and the student. And so there's a level of sort of entanglement in that relationship. So, I think historically we sort of, I've historically seen teaching more as a parent-child relationship, where the parent has the truth and the child has to learn this absolute truth. Whereas I think teaching should be more of a dialectical process of mutual learning. The teacher can learn as much from the student as the student could learn from the teacher. And that's where I have some issues with, this sort of shift towards digital technologies. I think that digital technologies have this incredible role of being able to share information at the speed of light. And we've got more information than we've ever had in human history. But at the same time, sometimes in a digital world, there's a collapse of context, where we can't use all our senses. We can't sort of pick up on the dynamics happening within the room. And so I think there just needs to be a balance between those two ways of learning. And digital is also quite, unless you're doing, software programming and those type of things, it's quite anchored in the abstraction. And I think one of the challenges I see is that I use this in some of the slides that I share. I have this slide of a person sitting in front of a computer and a farmer standing in the field. And what's important with the farmer is that a farmer's ideas and thoughts are connected to their actions. They're embedded in the environment. They might have to make some judgment calls around the price of wheat, or the weather conditions, or their financial position, or the nature of seeds they're going to plant, and so forth. And there's a real sort of nexus between their thoughts and actions. But what we've done over the last couple of decades with some of these digital technologies is we've actually separated our thoughts from our actions. And I think that's leading to a breakdown, a social contract sort of breakdown. And also I think it's leading to a sort of retreat back into Plato's cave, that we're sort of just getting caught up in our thoughts without realizing that we are living embodied beings, living in existing in a world, and our relevance comes through our relationships and our connectivity to the world, but with other people. And this idea that we're all going to just retreat to the metaverse is something I question quite a lot. I'm not saying it doesn't have incredible utility in some cases, but I struggle with this idea that the future's a digital headset.
I'm very interested in this entanglement idea. What it sparked in my mind was that people are on different divides from have different ideas, I suppose, rather than worldviews. I guess at the moment there's a lot of clashing of worldviews, but I would say that both sides think, well, if the other side can just come over to my side, it'll all be good. And me being on the other side doesn't affect anything. But we are being on different sides is constantly affecting something. We are entangled. We can't pretend, put our head in the sand and be divided about all these things, and it doesn't affect. We are entangled. So we're not separating ourselves at all, really, because we are all entangled, would you say?
Absolutely, Dale. And that also sort of extends to people's careers and where they end up in life. I mean, if I'm a CEO of a major company, do I sort of hold the delusion that my position is a function of my own my own capabilities alone. You know, so what about the parents? What about the teachers? What about the families? What about the broader community that have all had an impact on that individual's life? So I think, you know, there's this, what I call this sort of reductionist ego Cartesian way of seeing reality, where it's all about, you know, my own agency without sort of recognizing that. And I'm not saying that, you know, a lot of things that one of the challenges we had in the 21st century is this idea of living with paradox. So, you know, there's a wonderful line out of a Leonard Cohen, I think it's Leonard Cohen poem called "If you don't become the ocean, you'll be seasick every day." And it's this idea of living with contradiction and paradox, and being comfortable with that. So whilst you know, we're all entangled, and we need to recognize that entanglement, we also need to recognize that we all have agency in the world, and that we're all individuals. Each one of us has our own consciousness. Each one of us has our own agency. And so therefore, you know, liberty, I would actually argue, and Adrian Bajan talks about this with, you know, liberties relates to the sort of constructal law, this capacity to learn and evolve over time. So it's not just, you know, sometimes people sort of think about this in an ideological lens, whereas I would actually argue there's something more profound happening, that we all have agency in the world, and that. So it's how do we live in a world where both of those things can exist at the same time, the entanglement, but also the individual agency. And that requires us to almost hold two different thoughts in your mind at the same time. I used to say to staff that used to report through to me that the greatest risk is not taking any risk, which is a bit of a you know, it's another example of a paradox. So, and it's the same with, you know, this eternal debate between the mind and the body, or the mental world and the material world. So this is the challenge we have, is how do we get comfortable with that? And that requires people to recognize the human condition and the complexity of the world. I mean, it's just an amazing planet that we live on. So there needs to be a sense of awe and wonderment, and in that humility comes a desire to learn, a desire for open inquiry. I mean, Charles Sanders Peirce, he talks about this theory of open inquiry, that we're always learning, we're always evolving. But again, it's so different to what gets sort of presented in the mainstream media or in our various institutions.
It seems that coercion is quite the flavour at the moment in terms of the way we are being treated, and also the way our leaders are presenting themselves. And then we've also got this tribalism. So how might we use the knowledge of these various philosophers that also had quite varied views themselves to create a good society?
So there's two concepts in ancient Greek philosophy. And there was a podcast a little while ago with Jordan Peterson, and I think it was John Vervaeke that was talking about some of these terms. And there's this concept of philonikeia and philosophia. And philonikeia is this idea of this person that knows, you know, this person on the hill handing down their wisdom, their statements. Whereas philosophia is more about a dialectical process of, you know, sharing and listening. And, you know, that requires empathy. It requires an understanding that the world is complex, and no story or no way of looking at the world is right. You know, there's a narrative in science that I hear all the time around this theory of everything. that there's one theory that will capture the essence of the world we inhabit, but that just doesn't exist. So we need to have the capacity to recognize that complexity, and then recognize that the way that we'll evolve through the world is through having these dialectics. So there's that happens through the public sphere in media, but I would actually say that our current media has now completely broken down, and so we don't have these different views being shared in media. We have these different platforms that speak to their different groups, but we're not actually having different views being shared that well. I mean, there are some podcasts and so forth where they attempt to do that from these long form interviews, but a lot of media is very certain of their truths and beliefs in terms of how they see it. So we need to start listening. We need to be able to see the world from different perspectives and recognize that the inherent nature of the human condition. And the times where humanity has gone off the rails in history is when we become arrogant, and we think that we now have worked it out. You know, this primacy of human consciousness, which is this concept that moved out of Kant and Hegel. You know, this idea of second nature, that we create the world. We need to realize that there are some things we simply can't create or control because the world's too complex. So how do we live within that sort of harmony with the natural world and each other?
What springs to mind is something that I heard about reading a book, and people say that, or someone said that after reading a book and you read it again, you don't find something new in the book, you find something new in yourself. And I'm wondering whether really, when we try to clump people together and clump experiences together and clump science together and all these things together to know how to behave in certain situations, but really, if we come with a humble heart and an open mind, each person is going to, each time we see that same person, we're going to find something new in ourselves and a new way of relating with every different person. Would you say?
Absolutely. You see this in, just the diversity in society. You know, my parents came from the Netherlands, and my father's now passed away. But in that small country, the Netherlands, there's so many different languages and dialects and different ways of sharing and communicating. And, the same thing applies in places like Indonesia, where there's 17,000 plus islands and a whole bunch of different people with different perspectives. So we should be sort of embracing that richness. And Australia's in a very sort of fortunate position in that we have such a diverse population. But the question I have is, do we really sort of tap into that wisdom in that population? Or do we are we just reducing it to one or two dimensions? This idea of the left or the right, or it's such a simplistic way of looking at it, because if you sort of mapped any individual across that spectrum, assuming that you could reduce the complexity of humans to that left or the right, but even if you did that, I don't think it would be as binary as it gets presented. I think people have got all sorts of different perspectives on things. So it's when we start listening to that. In ancient or in African philosophy, Ubuntu philosophy, they have this saying, a person is a person through other persons. So how do we sort of, again, it's that, that connectivity and meaning comes through that exchange. The fact that two people can communicate with each other is one of the most astonishing things to think about. I mean, because of the ambiguity of language, I mean, we can mean so many different things by the use of language, but somehow language in itself gives us the capacity to communicate.
It's the number one principle, is it not? When we talk about concepts and ideas, and then we have to have the language to meet those. I mean, we call a chair, we don't call it the ceiling, for example. And so we've learnt to apply language. You're absolutely spot on. And I wonder whether or not the fact that our language is being applied so differently, that is really where we need to begin. And
there's a really good example of that, Cheryl, with there was a language that was invented in the 1950s called Loglan, Loglan, which stands for logical language. And their aspiration when they introduced this logical language was to remove all ambiguity and uncertainty of language. And it turned out to be an absolute disaster. Because if you sort of think about language, language has the capacity to adapt, provide context, and has an emergent quality. So for example, the word Bitcoin, if I went back 50 years ago, it didn't exist, but now it's been incorporated into modern language. So part of language and the success of language, you know, Wittgenstein talks about the limits of my language are the limits of my world. I would actually argue that language, out of all the forms of semantic abstraction, whether that's mathematics, you know, logic, computer languages and so forth, natural languages have the greatest capacity to express our experience of reality. So the fact that we've actually come up with languages that can do that and have the ability to evolve over time is incredible.
So would you say, I mean, from my point of view, it seems that language has been recently weaponized. And for instance, the term racist seems to be weaponized. I'm not sure that anyone would ever disagree with me on that. But with terms that have been weaponized, do you think that we should move away from and create new terms, or we should or could we reclaim terms? What do you think?
I think we need to recognize that whatever we do, whether it's use of language or use of mathematics or the use of algorithms, whenever we abstract the world, you know, whether it's computers, AI, for example, whenever we abstract the world, that is the picture of the world. It's not the world. And what I mean by that is the world's far too more complex than that. So when we think about things like racism, is it just about the language? You know, I would actually argue that racism is a high dimensional issue that we need to sort of explore, which includes everything from economics through to, you know, there's all sorts of things that we would need to sort of explore to better understand, you know, some of those issues that we're facing. And if we restrict that exploration to one dimension, we are going to find it difficult to solve some of the issues that we have. And a lot of the stuff, you know, the biggest challenge we have, and it comes from Rene Descartes and this Cartesianism, which is endemic across our society, is that we want a simple fake world when the world is complex instead of emergent. So we need to be comfortable with that complexity, which means that we need to recognize the uncertainty. We need to realize the emergent qualities of the world. And there's another term, it's a new scientific term called non-ergodicity. Sorry, I can't even pronounce it properly, but in essence, it's a term that was devised by Stuart Kauffman, who's a professor of theoretical biology. And because of the evolving nature of the world, memory matters. So history matters in this world. And the world doesn't sort of unfold like a mechanical machine. So a lot of the constructs that we use, like logic, are based off this sort of mechanical nature of reality. You know, the mind is a machine, the world is a machine, the body is a machine, but the world doesn't actually complete. There are patterns that can almost be translated into that sort of that way, but there are things that happen in the world that are simply unpredictable, and that's where some of these systems start breaking down. So if we don't sort of reflect on our abstraction and compare it to the world and constantly learn, we move further and further away from that world. And at some point there will be a crisis, because the way we are is moving further and further away from the way the world is. And you see that time and time again.
I loved it when I heard the word history coming from your description then. And I find it fascinating more and more that we seem to be raising children to think that history began the day they were born. And particularly with this term unlearning, which is being used quite broadly in a number of areas and disciplines. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there was people like Edmund Burke who spoke about the social contract and and this is in the 18th and 19th century. You know, he was a political philosopher, and he talks about the social contract being a contract between the dead, the living, and the future. And even people like Gödel, who he was this brilliant genius sort of mathematician of the early 20th century, you know, came up with this hypothesis around the limits of logic that sort of undermined this this certainty that people are aspiring to through logic. He also did some work around, you know, seeing reality as this sort of continuum. So the way I sort of see reality currently, subject to further change, is that the past, the current, and the future are all sort of interconnected. It's like one, you know, the fabric of reality. And this idea that we can somehow ignore the past. You know, the reason why I am the person I am today is because of the person I was yesterday and the person I was the day before. So this idea that we're going to somehow sever that connection doesn't sort of reflect how I sort of perceive reality. You know, again, it's a concept that David Kellogg Lewis, the American metaphysicist that spent a lot of time in Australia, spoke about in the 20th century. So again, I think a lot of these ideas that we're sort of holding out, you know, the mechanization of the mind, the mechanization of the world, this sort of Cartesian reductionism, the nature of history or reality. I just think we need to be having conversations as a broader society as to whether or not those assumptions that we're making really reflect the way the world actually unfolds. And that requires us to have the capacity to revisit our truths and beliefs. But we don't seem to have that reflexivity in society at the moment. You know, there's a wonderful YouTube video by the Center for New Economic Thinking that talks about, you know, what happens when economics no longer reflects the real world. And it's just talking about the cognitive dissonance between, you know, the prevailing economic theories that get taught in our universities, you know, classical and, you know, Keynesian economics, and, you know, the use of mathematics when the world's complex, and economics is more of a process of human discovery and creation than it is around a mathematical reductive number. But where do I share that idea? I mean, we just don't have a society at the moment that's willing to revisit some of these truths and beliefs. So if we don't have the capacity to reflect on what we think, how will we ever learn?
Yes, and I think when you're talking about history and the entanglement of history and how we've all evolved, and we've got, I mean, genetically, you know, biologically, environmentally, we are part of history. And it just made me think of, I think it's Eckhart Tolle, or there's a lot of New Age where it's all in the now. Just be in the now, forget the past, forget the future, just live in the now. And it's all about me in the now because I'm worth it. And I think that New Age thing has sort of come to a climax in those thoughts where it's not about God, it's not about history, it's not about anyone else, it's just about you because you're worth it. And it's just in the now, how you feel and what you do in the now creates your future. I think that whole concept is hypnotic and tied in with the sex, have lots of sex with lots of different people in lots of different environments, because it feels good in the now, is part of the problem. What would you say?
Yeah, there's a concept that Nassim Taleb uses. He talks about this delicatessen in the city of New York, and how this delicatessen's been in existence for a long period of time. And the longer that someone's in existence for, the greater is the potential capacity to make the assumption that whatever heuristics, whatever ways they're seeing the world, better align with the world, because they've actually survived that length of time. I think he also uses a term called grandmother's wisdom. The capacity to, someone that's lived on the planet for a long period of time has incredible amount of wisdom that they could share with all of us. So we need to recognize that the now will be, tomorrow, and the now will be yesterday, and that tomorrow will then come. And we need to recognize that there are people and insights that we can sort of share. So this idea of standing on the shoulders of giants, standing on the shoulders of our history and our thought, and then evolving and synthesizing those thoughts to reflect the new reality. I think that, to me, it's a process of continual, perpetual adaptation.
So we've got 3 questions that we haven't asked you yet, and Dale, I'm desperate to ask, the last one. So how about you start with the first?
Okay, so the first one is, what's the meaning of life?
I don't know the answer. I think the meaning of life is I think it's too complex for me to. It's the meaning. It's about the meaning of life. To me, comes through the relationships and the connections that I make.
Beautiful, beautiful. So the second one is, what have you learnt recently? What exciting new thing have you learnt recently?
Well, having the opportunity to sort of stand in front of some students and share some insights has been fantastic. So again, it's made me realize the limits of this sort of digital narrative, that I think we are physical human beings that are embodied in the world. So this idea that we'll spend the rest of our existence in front of computers just doesn't feel right to me. So this, the idea of embodiment.
Beautiful.
It's interesting because as soon as you said, you're in front of students, I had 2 images. The first image was of yourself sitting on a chair on a stage, an auditorium full of students who are full of curiosity. And the other image I had was you sitting in your pajamas, I suppose, not that I went that far, but relaxing in front of a computer screen and not having the tangibility of the energy in the room. So when you said teaching, what did you mean? Where were you?
I think it's more interaction. I mean, the 5-week program that we just finished was very very sort of engaging. So there was a room of 70+ students, quite a big auditorium in Western Sydney, and it was a series of desks. So there were points, Cheryl, where I was sharing some insights in front of the students, but a lot of the work was done by other presenters and by the students themselves. So it was very much a sort of interactive process. So, and it was quite interesting because the students were turning up in a lot of cases like an hour before these 3-hour sessions, which I found incredible. And some of those students had been, with the pandemic and the lockdowns, away from these institutions for the last couple of years. So them sort of coming together and learning from each other is as valuable as a whole bunch of people standing on a stage.
Oh, look, absolutely. And you answered the question. It was face-to-face, it was live, magnificent. So with all of your wisdom and insights and the way you have been able to merge your reading and research and learning with living life to the fullest, what would you do if you were the boss of Australia?
I would, I would try to sort of change the narrative around education. There's a real, I hear it all the time that we all need to learn STEM, science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. But if only it was that simple. So I would sort of change the narrative to one of learning, and that would then infuse the rest of society, because I think that would, if I think about some of our major media companies, I would ask those companies to sort of think about what they do in the context of learning, which would be more about having longer form conversations with different perspectives and being willing to sort of hold that space without sort of coming to a conclusion too quickly.
Wow.
Well, if they don't, they're going to be gone. So, which is probably more likely. So I would just reminded me of Cheryl has got an idea for an NDIS style education, and I was wondering if you could share that, Cheryl.
Oh, so essentially it's a education investment initiative whereby instead of the money flowing directly to schools as it currently does, there's an investment made for every child, that a family in conjunction with the child can make decisions about where that is actually invested. So therefore, what do the children need or want to learn? Who is going to be the one working with them on that? And where would that take place? To enable exactly what you were talking about, a greater interconnectedness of people who are there to help others learn. And that, in my view, is part of the lifelong element as well, because it wouldn't be limited to the 13 years that we currently have in terms of our limit of alleged compulsory school education. What do you think?
I think it's brilliant. There's a company in the States, sorry, not in the States, in France. It was founded by a French billionaire called School0sity, and it's a future-proof computer science training school that trains individuals in computer engineering and software. And what they've done with their program is that it's largely sort of gamified. So a lot of it's around self-learning. And the only requirement is that you're over the age of 18 to join the school, and that you've passed, there's a certain selection process, but there's no need to sort of share any diploma or school record. So it's this sort of immersive way of learning. Mm-hmm. So I think anything that sort of opens up learning to different ways of learning and enables sort of innovation in how we learn or what is learning. And I think one of the constructs that we have at the moment, which is actually impeding our progress, is, this idea that I go to primary school and secondary school for X number of years, then I might go on to TAFE or university, is a very sort of compartmentalized way of learning. And so how do we sort of shift the system to one of curiosity and lifelong learning? So any system that provides greater agency to the individual to make choice, and thereby enables innovation, whether it's School0sity. And it's my understanding that School0sity, it might now be in Adelaide. I think that was their first international school, and I think it's being rolled out in the US as well. So those sort of ideas will only come through sort of innovation and really sort of questioning some of the prevailing narratives that we have. But it sort of concerns me, particularly in the West, whether it's in the United States or Australia, just where we're sort of heading with education. I think it's a very I think it's sort of anchored in very sort of industrial age sort of principles. And I don't think it's really sort of equipping society for this world of complexity that we're all facing into.
I think that I wonder, with the tragic suicide of the EY worker recently, who was at her desk at a ridiculous time at night. I wonder whether parents, one of the major obstacles is that parents are working such long hours that they really haven't got any time to reflect on the education of their children. So it's not a lack of desire or ability or intelligence or whatever, but I just worry that parents just don't have time to be able to even think about their child's education.
So that point you just made there, Dale, about reflection. So this this need to integrate our mind and our bodies. So Charles Sanders Peirce talks about two gates. He talks about the gate of perception, which is how do we make sense of the world? How do we abstract the world? How do we perceive the world? And the gate of purposive action. So how do we then act in the world? How do we have agency? That's a different way of thinking than this sort of Cartesian way of deductive logic or propositional logic. And again, without this reflection, we won't learn. So there's so much insight in these US pragmatist philosophers and how we could potentially use that as a way to evolve and to sort of integrate our ideas with our actions in the world. But again, the system as it stands is not necessarily giving those parents, as you said, the capacity to reflect because they're too busy. But I think the reflection and the friction, and what I mean by friction is the cognitive dissonance. I've got an idea I think the world works in this way, but I'm experiencing the world in a fundamentally different way. And that disconnect is cognitive dissonance, and that's friction. It's saying that the way I'm understanding the world is not really aligning with the world. How do we incorporate those sort of ideas that integrate our actions in the world with our ideas? Otherwise, we are retreating to Plato's cave. And the thing with AI, I've been sort of thinking a lot about the difference between science, art, and computation. And computation is really abstraction upon abstraction. So what I mean by that is that, for example, in AI, what you might do is you might have 1,000 pictures of a dog. Okay, the human actually chooses the pictures that look like a dog or are a dog because they sort of understand the nexus between the picture and their experience in the world, and there's some semantic meaning to those pictures. And then we put them into a computer and it comes up with a manifold in a high dimensional space that represents what a dog might look like. So what I'm saying is that the picture was already an abstraction, and then we're putting it through a system of another system of abstraction. So if we just sort of embrace these ideas without sort of connecting these ideas to our experience in the world, we are going to create a Tower of Babel.
Yes.
And we need people that can sort of understand the difference between the picture of the pipe and the physical pipe. Absolutely. And I actually think we've the discussion about in so many areas. I mean, the environment's another example. How can we reduce the environment discussion to one dimension? It doesn't make any sense. I mean, the environment's a complex dynamic system. How can we say it's down to one dimension?
Because we think we're God.
But again, this is this primacy of human consciousness, so this is this sort of post-Kant Hegel world. And it's when we start integrating. I'm not saying that the fact that we have this capacity to create the world, it's an amazing capacity, but it's how do we sort of integrate that with the world? And the world, there are things in the world that are completely outside of our control. And I actually think this primacy of human consciousness and the primacy of existence, if I was to look at this at the meta level, I actually think it's the #1 issue for humanity for the 21st century.
Fascinating. You might be familiar with Tytler's work and his cycle of civilization, and he talks about the fact that, you know, most civilizations last around 200 years, and we sort of move from we begin quite spiritual, and then we go around this cycle where eventually we become so self-centered and so selfish and demanding and lazy, and we have expectations that everything will be given to us, that we finish up in bondage, and that civilization just, you know, disappears and a new one unfolds. Do you think that there's any merit in that type of context?
I think there's a long history of this. Joseph Tainter has come up with a series of theories on the collapse of complex societies. So when we no longer learn, we no longer have the capacity to adapt to that complexity.
Mm.
And that complexity then results in our own demise, because we're now using more and more energy and more resources to hold the system together. So if we want to, you know, as that constructor law sort of outlines, for a living system to survive, it needs to sort of morph and change over time. And yet we want to sort of create this society where nothing changes. We're almost sort of trying to defy gravity.
We come back to balance and reason, don't we? And you know, this has been fabulous. I've learned so much from you today. I've actually got more curiosity now than I had when we began. What about you, Gail?
Definitely. I always find speaking to Richard that it does spark my curiosity even more. Yes. So I suppose, Richard, what would you encourage? What's your final message? What would you? Is there something that you could encourage every person to do?
Yeah, I would say I've got this little slide. I'm happy to share some slides. If anyone that's listening to this wants some frameworks and slides, I've had the opportunity over the last couple of years to think about what they might look like, and I'm happy to share those. But I'd make the following statement, that the idea that all knowledge is sort of interconnected. I think it might be a comment that David Deutsch, the UK physicist, said, if I'm correct, but I could be wrong. So just put an asterisk against that. But what I mean by that is that we need to sort of encourage what I call a T approach to education and learning. And what we have at the moment is we have this more and more specialization. So we're becoming more and more narrow in our sort of understanding of reality, which is, you know, we might specialize. I saw this a lot in finance and banking, where someone, you know, people either come from a, you know, mathematical background in finance, because a lot of finance these days they've embraced mathematics and computation and those type of things. But if you sort of go deep and you don't sort of think about the interrelationships and connections, you have this massive blind spot. So I would encourage people to sort of try to integrate philosophical thought with science and computing and, you know, their experience in the world. I think all knowledge is interconnected. And I think, you know, too often, which is very much an industrial age concept, we sort of compartmentalize that knowledge, you know. So we have the natural sciences, the social sciences, the humanities, you know, the separate departments of our major universities. When I would actually argue that the way that we will make progress going forward is by looking at the relationships between those different domains, because they're all connected.
Systems thinking.
And system thinking, there's two types of systems thinking. There's what I call sort of zoom in and zoom out abstraction. So we zoom in and we reduce things to atoms and particles and pieces. And the zoom out, which is we look at the system at a meta level, you know, we look at the relationships and interconnections. But both those things are two forms of abstraction, which are still forms of Cartesianism. I would actually argue there's a third way, which is the embodied way. that were in the system.
Mm.
And that embodied way of thinking is this perpetual need for learning. You know, we observe, we orient, we decide, we act. It's this sort of perpetual loop. We're entangled in the system. Our context matters. So a lot of the concepts we have, for example, for risk or for health, what we're doing is we're abstracting it, but we're not recognizing that your context or my context could be different. You know, we saw this with the response to the pandemic. There was no discussion about individual context. It was all about, we must do this as a society and everyone must do this, without sort of taking into account the individual context. So I think to me there's three types of thinking. There's sort of reductive deductionist thinking, there's zooming out and looking at the systems. And then there's also this sort of entangled way of being. And I think the other thing we need to start doing is thinking of a lot of what we experience is not as a static, discrete thing, but as a flow or a process. You know, the weather's always changing. It never stays static. You know, living systems are always changing. We're always changing. Fashion's always changing. The economy's changing. That's a process. That's not this sort of discrete thing. So, for example, the use of the term GDP is sort of reflecting this sort of discrete reductionist thing, when the reality is that the economy is a process. That's the sort of shift. These are the profound shifts that we need to make.
Yes, and I think looking at the relationships, I mean, the relationships in the economy and the deals that are done and stuff like that, I've sort of been learning about a lot of that lately. And because if you see it just as a mechanistic situation, or money gets transferred here to here and that sort of thing, you lose the big picture, which is who's doing deals with what and how, who's really running things, I guess, as well.
Mm-hmm. I mean, I remember seeing something else. It was a video I saw on innovation where this individual was sort of suggesting that a lot of senior executives attend a wine appreciation course. And the reason why he was sort of suggesting that was because a lot of what we talk about is around the qualitative. You know, it's a number on a page. But how do you actually appreciate a glass of wine? Can you sort of reduce that experience to a number on a page? I'm not sure.
Good point. Well, thank you so much. This has been so enlightening and exciting and interesting. I would just like to say God bless you and thank you. Any final words, Cheryl?
I'm looking forward to the next one so that we can unpack education and live it and talk it and see what we can come up with together. Be wonderful.
Brilliant.
No, that sounds great, Cheryl, and keep going with the ideas that you have. I think there's a tremendous amount of merit to what you're doing around giving the consumer of education or the user of education the capacity to decide.
Thank you. Thanks very much. I look forward to sharing more with you next time. It's been a wonderful conversation. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks so much.